Okay, so I'm Kristin Morris. I am an archivist at the Computer History Museum. I'm interviewing today Bruce Davie for the VMware Founders Collection, and this will become part of the Computer History Museum collection. Today is September 25th, 2026. Bruce, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Very quickly, just tell us your name and your current place of residence and your current occupation or endeavor.
Yeah, so I'm Bruce Davie and I live in Melbourne, Australia. And my current occupation is I'm self-employed. I am the co-founder and I guess half owner of a small company called Systems Approach. And Systems Approach I founded with Larry Peterson, and we do lots of activities all around education, writing books, newsletters, producing courses, occasionally even producing software. But I'd say our primary output is written educational material for computer scientists.
Tell me a little bit about your education and path into networking.
Yeah, so I grew up in Melbourne, where I live now. I did an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering, but then I left to do a PhD in computer science at the University of Edinburgh. And my field of focus there was not networking. This was in the days when networking was not very well established. And so I worked on some fairly esoteric aspects of formal verification. But then on finishing my PhD, I was fortunate enough to land a job at Bellcore, which was an offshoot of the old Bell Labs based in New Jersey, and was a place that was really at the forefront of networking research. And I think they hired me on the strength of the fact that I had learned something about computer science and research and figured that the networking piece would follow. And so I began my career as a networking researcher in 1988. And in those days, while the internet was already about 15 years old, it was not a mainstream thing. And in fact, the first time I ever had access to the internet was my first day at Bellcore in 1988, because we didn't have it yet in either Australia or the UK at that point. So I started learning about the internet, but I was learning about all kinds of different networking technologies because it was not at that point obvious that the internet was going to be the one that would come out on top. And so I worked on a few different technologies, particularly ATM, which was very much the hot thing back in those days. And after I'd been at Bellcore for a few years, the internet did start to become a big thing. Probably, the big turning points were things like the rise of dial-up access to the internet and the launch of the Mosaic and then Netscape browsers to sort of provide mass access to internet to a much wider group of people. And I sort of figured this was where the world was going, and that actually led to me leaving Bellcore and going to Cisco, which at the time was about a 5,000 person company that clearly was going to be important in this burgeoning thing called the internet. And I managed to leverage my research credentials to land a job there. So that's really how I got started in networking. I guess that's a long answer, but that was, kind of a fairly random series of events, but I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, as so often happens.
Mm-hmm. When you were moving into when you were working on this research, and especially after getting hired at Cisco, like, where did you see the internet going? This was mid 90s, late-ish 90s. Where did you see the internet going at that
Yeah, I
time?
mean, there was this sort of sense of exponential growth was starting to become apparent in terms of number of people who were using it was doubling fairly frequently. I don't know the interval, but maybe it was doubling every year or every 6 months. So there was definitely a sense of exponential growth. And I do remember thinking the thing that's going to have to happen for this to continue is it's going to have to be something that people start having in their homes, which by and large was not the case in the early 90s. And I do remember a point when people started getting access through things like America Online. And I actually remember like a friend asking me, how should I get on the internet? And I said, well, it's probably just easy enough to get an account with AOL. Um, and I always regret that I didn't go and buy some AOL shares at the time. But it was it was one of those things where it was kind of apparent that the internet was going to grow if people outside of the academic and research community started using it. And that was starting to become apparent in the in the mid to late 90s. I think it was around the time that the Netscape IPO was a pretty famous event in that era, and it made major news publications. So you didn't have to be a genius to see the internet growing. And I guess in terms of my personal view on it, the big shift for me was from thinking about networking in terms of telephone networks, because I was at the Bell system, and thinking about it as something that got built in a very controlled and sort of top-down way. I worked on a project where we were going to build the replacement for the telephone switching system that could do voice, video, and data. And this was all based on ATM. And, we had this vision that we would replace central office switches with these packet switches that we were building, and that would be the next generation of networking. And that essentially turned out to be quite wrong in some important ways. Although I guess today, if you go into a central office, you'll find a lot more internet gear than you would find telephone switching gear. But our sense of it being sort of the next step to the telephone network was completely wrong. And this was an era where people like to talk about the net heads versus the bell heads. And I was kind of in the net head unit within the bell head company, if you like. And then when I went to Cisco, I joined the net heads. And but it did start to become obvious to me in that early 90s period that the internet was more likely to win than anything else. And I remember we were working on ATM packet switching as we thought it was going to become really important. But I remember working with people who already had such a strong knowledge of what was going on with the internet technologies that they kind of persuaded me that ATM at best was going to be just one part of the internet, and that it wasn't going to be this global network. It was going to be just a different form of networking that would sit alongside other things like Ethernet. And in the end, that was exactly right, and in fact maybe overstates the importance of ATM in the great scheme of things. But to the extent that ATM was ever successful, it was just one other technology alongside many others, whereas the thing that really took off was internet technology, because of the way it was built to be able to scale globally, to be able to accommodate all kinds of different networks. And so, it's sometimes hard for me to look back and think, how was I such, I look back some things I thought at the time was like, wow, why was I so stupid? But of course, we have the benefit of hindsight now to look back and say, yes, well, the decisions that were made in the 70s in particular around how the internet was architected, they proved to be extremely good decisions. But it's become much more apparent with hindsight to how good those decisions were.
Well, and I think that level of scalability, as you talked about, like it's hard to envision. It's hard to even wrap your head around a solution that's going to be able to scale to orders of magnitude beyond what any enterprise has ever had to adjust for in the past, right? Like it's just so much bigger, so fast. I'm wondering how that issue of scalability then crops up 10 years later in the late 2000s, right? With Cisco, question. How does that come up again?
So when I came to Cisco, I worked with a pretty amazing team of people. And one of the people I was lucky to work with is Eric Rosen, who is a few years older than me, and really was there in the early days of the internet. His very important to the history of MPLS, but even before that, he was the person who wrote the predecessor of BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol. He wrote a thing called EGP, which you have to go back pretty far to find people who know what that is. But anyway, Eric was an absolute pioneer in networking, and I learned a lot from working with him. And he would say things like, well, the only hard problem in networking is scale. And to some extent, that's a very good encapsulation of what you have to think about when you're building networks, because almost every problem could be solved easily if you weren't concerned about scaling it up. Sure, it's probably hard to get lots of bits down a single fiber, and there are people who have to worry about those kind of problems. But actually build a network that goes beyond a couple of connections to dozens to hundreds to billions. Those problems are really hard. And ultimately, most networking issues come down to how do you scale things. And so I learned that fairly early in my days at Cisco, and I'd say that was absolutely a guiding principle. And it's quite a subtle thing too, because everybody in the internet community believes that scalability is important, but people will often say, if they don't like your idea, they'll just say, well, that doesn't scale. But they haven't necessarily thought through, well, what aspect of scaling are we talking about? Because there's often lots of different dimensions. And I mean, one area, I guess, quite close to my heart is the scalability of the human operation of a network is incredibly important. And arguably, the only two things I've done that have been useful in networking have been in the space of improving the manageability of networks by humans. And I'd say MPLS and SDN both kind of tackle that problem. And so that is, there's one thing to say, how many watts does it take to build your system, or how many fibers do you need, or whatever. Like, there's lots of different ways to measure scale, but a really important one is, well, how many hours of human labor does it take to make a change, and how long does it take to instantiate the service that you want, and things like that. That kind of scale is as important as any other aspect, and I think that's where a lot of my work over the decades ended up going.
Mm. So is this part of scalability what led you to virtualization of the network?
In a sense, yes. That I mean, I became interested in software-defined networking while I was in the last few years of my time at Cisco, and it was being positioned for a lot of different purposes. But ultimately, the thing that got me to sort of make the jump to actually go and work for an SDN company, which was Nicira, the reason I went to work for them was because they were tackling a scalability problem, and they found the niche where the manageability of the network was really a big problem, and that was in building networks to connect virtual machines. Mm-hmm. And so the problem that Nicira went after very successfully was network virtualization, and essentially by adopting SDN as the tool for tackling this problem of how do you connect virtual machines, the team at Nicira was able to come up with a solution which became the basis for network virtualization, which fundamentally meant you could now deploy tens of thousands of networks at the click of a button, instead of it being a manual process that required many, many hours of manual labor.
So Nicira was acquired by VMware in 2012. You were there. It was a relatively brief period of time that you were technically employed by them before you came on board with VMware. So can you talk about the transition from the startup into being part of VMware?
Yeah. So I will say that the decision by both parties, VMware and Nicira, to complete that acquisition was very, very good for all concerned. And I think it wasn't obvious to everybody what a good idea it was, but I know Martin Casado came to my house a few weeks before the acquisition was announced to let me know that it was likely to happen. And we talked about what was the implications, and I could not have been more excited because it was just such an obviously good fit. So from that perspective, it was fantastic. Of course, there is a massive difference between working for a company with about 100 employees that is focused on a single product and just trying to grow as fast as possible, versus taking that little group and merging it into a multi-thousand person company that has an existing product base and an existing sales force and a whole lot of other existing processes. So I don't think it's ever really fair to compare a startup against a big company. But I will say, the execution of that acquisition was very positive, and it ultimately worked out really well. In terms of, it enabled us to bring that product to a much, much bigger set of customers, and turn it into a really successful revenue generator, while at the same time, it actually enabled VMware to make the transition from a company that effectively had one successful product to a company that now has a huge portfolio of successful products, of which network virtualization is one. And so, I think one of the things that was very exciting about that whole experience was we got to be part of the transformation of VMware from a product company to a platform company. And I can't say we get too much credit for that, but we certainly were an ingredient that led to that happening.
So VMware took Nicira's product sort of whole cloth and pushed it to market. Yes.
That is true, although the story is a lot more complicated.
Of course. Please share.
Yeah,
It always is.
So, the product that we had, because we didn't have direct access to VMware's source code, we had really built a customer base around open source. And so the people who were using the Nicira product tended to be quite sophisticated customers who had open source hypervisors and knew how to put together a system from a bunch of parts. And we had on the order of 6 customers at the time that we joined VMware who were uniformly quite sophisticated in their ability to put things together and manage the fact that we gave them part of what they needed to build a solution, but they needed a bunch of other pieces. And VMware customers are typically enterprises who are used to getting their software from their enterprise software provider and sort of putting it in production and having it work. So what we ended up with was effectively 2 different streams of products, one based on what Nicira did, which was to keep on supporting these big, sophisticated, open source oriented customers, and one based on the existing VMware product portfolio. And so those 2 products were effectively sold as NSX, but NSX effectively was 2 separate products. And we labeled them as NSX MH and NSX V for multi-hypervisor and vSphere. And that essentially gave us the opportunity to now build a network virtualization business and address that entire set of customers. And then over time, we built a third system, which combined pieces of the first 2 and tried to meet the needs of all customers, and that became the NSX-T product, which I guess internally it was known as NSX Transformers, but we had to drop that name due to copyright issues. But we got some great swag out of it.
I bet.
So that in the end it was, that story that I just told you around the 3 products, that's like a multi-year story with,
Right.
massive amounts of argumentation around what should be the right path forward. But I guess in the end, the products were all successful.
I think it also says something about VMware that they didn't try to, but they didn't immediately sort of push aside that group of super technical, almost bespoke customers who were building it themselves. Like that arguably that's a very small customer. That's a relatively small market, right? So that they could have said, oh, okay, it works great for those folks, but there's not really a big growth option there. Let's not spend our resources trying to give them a product that works. Let's just move towards the
there's
bigger.
an interesting point there, I think, which is that we did bring more than just a product to VMware. We brought a set of customers who were not classic VMware customers, and even though there was a small number of customers, they were big, they were open source oriented, and they were developer focused as well, typically. So there were a bunch of things in there which I think over the intervening decade have proven to be very important. I think we can see how over the last decade, focusing on developers has become much more of an issue for VMware, and the rise of things like Docker or containers and Kubernetes, all of that kind of open source focused on developers technology, that was all underway when we joined through the acquisition. And to some extent, we brought some of the capabilities that were necessary for VMware to make that transition as well. VMware was, and I think is still a very well-run company that, did not simply bring in that acquisition and smother it. and I've seen a lot of acquisitions over the years because, as you know, Cisco was an acquisition machine, and there it's hit or miss. Some of them are super successful, some of them get smothered pretty quickly, and then there's a range in the middle. I mean, sometimes the acquired company takes over the acquirer effectively, as I think we sort of saw that in the early days of Cisco. So I think that the Nicira acquisition was one of those ones that was broadly successful, even if not everything that we had built at Nicira lived on, but the capabilities and the sort of the focus on things like open source were definitely more than just the product and the engineers that we brought to the table.
It just occurs to me too that didn't VMware's very first product, it was Linux based, right? They were testing it, they were pushing it out to people who were super knowledgeable, who could be able to kind of use it, break it, play with it.
Yes, I think that VMware in the very early days had that same kind of mindset, but I think that was a long time before we arrived.
Yeah, right. But it just keeps coming around. Yeah. So tell me, what was your impression? Certainly, I'm sure you had been sort of following VMware's trajectory from a bit from outside, just being in Silicon Valley and being associated with that technology. Generally, what was your impression once you got to the inside of VMware?
I mean, there were pluses and minuses, I guess, as with every company. I mean, I think one thing that was very striking to me was what a strong engineering culture there was at VMware. And with all due respect to my previous employers, I would say it was very striking to me. And one of the examples that I've probably told to everybody who's ever asked me this question was it took about 6 months before Pat Gelsinger asked me to come and have a meeting with him. And the reason that happened was because I was working on a technology that he was interested in, and he wanted to understand it. And so he asked me to go into his office and explain it to him. And that just blew me away. It was like, wow, a CEO who wants to talk to an engineer about their project was not something I'd come across before in a big Silicon Valley company. And I think, obviously Pat is an engineer and a very good one. But I think, he was a very good fit for the culture of VMware for exactly that reason. And he follows a long line of engineering CEOs at VMware. So I think that's, and of course he's been followed by another engineer in Raghu. So, so I think that, that's one example. But to me, the principal engineer at VMware was treated with a great deal of respect because they were, considered sort of the engine of the company in a way that I hadn't seen previously, and the the extent to which engineering and other things like having a conference like Radio, where a couple of thousand engineers go into a hotel for 3 days and talk about sort of way out in left field engineering stuff for 3 days. Again, I'd never seen anything like that. That's the sort of thing you do with salespeople. Like, who would have thought you could do that with engineers? So these were the kind of things that I was pretty impressed by at VMware.
Tell me about your trajectory, your career trajectory at VMware. You were working on NSX, that evolved, but you didn't stay in one place, certainly. So
no, indeed. So I mean, I came in as a principal engineer, which was pretty nice. That they kind of looked at my history and judged that I was good enough to sort of rub shoulders with the giants of VMware. And so I came in that role as part of the NSX team. After a few years, when Martin Casado took over as the general manager for the networking and security business unit, I moved up into his role as CTO for that business unit, which was a nice, I guess, trajectory for me because I had been hired into Nicira as kind of be Martin's backup. So I kind of was. And then when he became general manager, I became CTO. So that was nice. And honestly, not that different than the job I was doing previously, but it did mean like I now had the ability to go and speak on behalf of the whole organization at the sort of executive level, which was definitely valuable for me and hopefully for the business unit as well. And then I did that up until about 2017. And at that point, I sort of started exploring an option that had been at the back of my mind for a very long time, which was how to retire in Australia. um, and I still haven't figured out how to retire, but I have figured out how to get back to Australia. So I did a bit of research around what was going on in the company, and found that there was an opportunity to take a CTO role in Asia Pacific. And that was originally, I think, advertised as a Singapore job, but with a bit of discussion between me and the general manager for Asia Pacific, we managed to find a way to make that job exist in Australia instead. And so in early 2017, I moved out of my business unit role into a field role, and that turned out to be an extremely positive move, not just because I got to come and live in Australia, which is quite nice, but because it was actually my first ever job in the field after almost 30 years in the industry. I'd always worked in research and development. And I managed to end up sitting next to Pat Gelsinger on a plane during the first few weeks of my job as a field person. And he told me a story about when he was at Intel, where he was told by some senior person at Intel, I don't remember who it was, but this person apparently didn't like Pat very much, but said that, Pat, there's nothing wrong with you that wouldn't be fixed by 2 years as a bag carrying salesman. And I believe that the gist of that story was you can learn a lot that will make you a better contributor to the company by being involved in the sales force. So my role as the Asia Pacific CTO was to be the technical face of VMware in the field, which is both a customer-facing role, but also a role that brings you into contact with the salespeople and with particularly the pre-sales engineers. And so I was effectively responsible for leading the 600 or so pre-sales engineers in Asia Pacific. And in the end, that was a tremendously valuable experience, where I had to learn a whole bunch of things that I hadn't learned before about how the field works, but also how management of large teams works. And I sometimes wonder how different my life would have been if I hadn't been so afraid of management roles. That I'm actually found it quite enjoyable. And Pat also told me some stories about how he always enjoyed managing people, just because of how you get to have such a big impact. If you can manage people effectively, then the multiplier effect on your work is much greater than what you can do as an individual. So basically having a 600-person team that I could have influence over was an opportunity that I, in some respects, should have taken up earlier, I suppose. But it was tremendously valuable as a learning experience, and it was a demanding job. I will say that there's a reason why I have a different job now, which is I'm not sure how many more years I could have done that, but it was demanding and satisfying as these things tend to be.
Was it? Was there a particular challenge did you find a particular challenge in working, managing teams in that region, as opposed, maybe you could conceptualize that it might be different in other regions?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a pretty culturally diverse region. I think 50 countries roughly, and time zones stretch from I can't remember how many there are, but it's from here to India is like 5.5 hours one way, and here to New Zealand's a couple of hours the other way, and then there's everything in between. And yeah, so it's a big region, very culturally diverse. I actually took a couple of days of cultural training as part of my preparation for making the move. And it's not much you can learn in 2 days, but at least you kind of learn what to look out for, and really basic things, just like how being a senior person in certain Asian cultures will cause people to defer to you in a way that you would not have expected. And so apparently sometimes it could be hard to get off the phone because the only person who's allowed to end the phone call is the most senior person. And if you don't know that, you're never getting off the phone. So just little things like that there's a million things that you need to be aware of. And so just, I guess, getting at least enough surprising insights like that I knew not to be overconfident in my ability to deal with different cultures was a positive thing. Um, I think the other thing was just being in the field. You need to understand the relationship between how do you motivate technical people, which I've sort of been doing that for a long time, versus how do you motivate people when there's a very clear metric of success, which is did the customer buy the product? Um, and this was a thing where I worked really closely with my boss because he had this very, I think, positive view of the technical pre-sales team as people whose job is to make sure the customer buys the right thing. And make sure the customer likes what they buy, deploys it, and wants to come back and buy something in a couple of years' time. So not focused on did we move the product this quarter, but did we make the customer successful and happy so that we will still be moving products a couple of years from now. So that kind of long-term focus from my boss was very helpful, and I really tried to sort of push that view to the team. And then, in terms of sort of other cultural issues, it's just like I have some very strong views about work-life balance, and I feel like I've been successful throughout my career having pretty good work-life balance. And I would see people just working absurdly long hours. And it was seemingly that was what they were expected to do. And so it can be challenging to figure out what to do with that sort of situation where, well, it's probably somewhat cultural, but at the same time, like you can't have people burning themselves out. And so trying to work through some of those issues was definitely an interesting challenge.
This does sort of dovetail with one of my questions, which is about who are the people that you worked with at VMware who you felt had a really strong impact on your career and your work.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've mentioned Pat a few times. It's just astonishing what a powerful and admirable leader he is. And it's VMware was lucky to have him, I guess, for as long as they did. And I'm sure Intel's very happy to have him now too, as he navigates them through their challenges. So I mentioned my boss for the APJ role was Duncan Hewitt. Super empathetic and kind leader. I think not what you would expect for somebody leading a sort of $1 billion sales organization. And he's also writing books these days about things to do with how to empower women in the workforce. And so I think like he's got a very strong sense of how to try to manage through cultural issues in the workplace, both having had a long APJ career and also having worked in tech, where obviously we need to take active steps to empower more women in tech. So Duncan has great experience around those kind of issues, and I learned a lot from him. And then I mean, Martine was the person who was the person who recruited me into Nicira, was my boss for most of my time at the networking and security business unit. Just an exceptional person who has the unusual combination of being exceptionally smart and also extremely good at managing people and motivating people. I think he sort of had in his mind a model of how every person ticked, so that he could sort of go to that person and say the thing that would motivate them to go and do what he needed to move the organization forward. And so, being part of Martine's team was very valuable, and the way he communicated the goals of the team clearly, sometimes repetitively, to make sure that no one was getting confused. I thought he was a really inspirational leader. So, yeah, those are some of the ones I've been pretty lucky to work with. Probably also should mention too, the engineering team at Nicira, just the sort of rank and file engineers were just the most extraordinarily talented people. Like they'd all pretty much come from the PhD programs of the top schools in America, or else they'd cut their teeth at other companies. And it was just an unbelievably strong engineering team. And so there was just so much I could learn from sitting down and talking to an engineer about how the product worked, because I was relatively late to the team, so I needed to learn how things worked, and it was astonishing how how good these people were, not just at writing code and building complex systems, but also explaining it to other people. So yeah, that was a tremendous experience.
Um, is there a product or a VMware product or project that you are most proud of?
Um, well, I do think the product that we built at Nicira and then continued to support for several years into VMware, the original NSX, that was an exceptional product. That's probably the thing I have the most pride about being involved with. Over my time at VMware, I had less and less direct involvement with products, and so it was hard for me to sort of have my fingerprints on a lot of different things. I became more and more of a mouthpiece for what other people were doing. But yeah, that'd be the one. The NSX original multi hypervisor product it was an exceptional piece of technology.
My last question, which I ask everyone, is what do you think is the lasting impact of VMware's technology?
I think VMware basically democratized the idea of data centers for the enterprise. That data centers, by and large, we still think of Amazon and Google and Microsoft as the people who really know how to run big data centers. But in fact, thousands of enterprises run data centers based on VMware software, and that is essentially what we were able to do. Really, it had already started before I came to VMware, but when we brought in the network virtualization piece, and then the storage team did the storage virtualization piece, and the management team did all the pieces to actually make these things manageable. Again, one of my pet topics. Those things combined with the original vSphere product made it possible for essentially anybody to run a modern data center. And that continues today with the open source projects based around Kubernetes and probably lots of other things that I'm not even across now. But I think the big impact is running a data center is not just for the biggest, most sophisticated companies. It is effectively something that any reasonable enterprise can do, and that, of course, has all kinds of ripple effects, whether it's around environmental impact, because VMware is very good at getting people to use their resources more efficiently, and that includes reducing energy consumption. It has impact on security because people can have their own perimeter where their data never leaves. That's a whole other story, I suppose. But there's a lot of positive impacts. But I think if you try and boil it down to one thing, it is that sort of democratizing access to software that lets people manage their own data centers.